I almost didn't answer the phone. It was one of those random numbers with an area code I didn't recognize, and I usually just let those ring. If it's important, they'll leave a voicemail. That's kind of been my rule for years. For some reason, though, I picked up. I don't know why. Maybe I was expecting a package. Maybe I was just bored. Honestly, if I'd waited like 2 more seconds, it would have gone to voicemail anyway. I answer and just go, "Hello?" There's a pause. Then this older guy goes, "Michael?" I tell him, no, I think you've got the wrong number. He goes quiet for another second. Then he says, "I'm really sorry." I tell him it's fine, and I'm about to hang up when he says, "Actually, can I ask you something?" Now, normally, that's where you hang up, because nothing good has ever followed the words, "Can I ask you something?" from a complete stranger. But he sounded normal, not creepy, not like a scammer reading a script. He just sounded tired. So I was like, sure? He lets out this sigh and says, "My brother gave me this number. I haven't talked to him in almost 12 years. That immediately got my attention. I told him he definitely had the wrong person. He said, "I know." Then he laughed a little. Guess he gave me a fake number. And honestly, I didn't know what to say. There was just something kind of sad about it. So instead of hanging up, I asked, "What happened?" He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he goes, "It's a long story." Now here's the thing. Most people would have ended the call right there. I probably should have. But I was literally just sitting on my couch doing nothing. So I said, "I've got time." And that's how I ended up spending the next 45 minutes talking to a complete stranger. His name was Frank. He was in his 60s. He lived about 3 states away. He told me he and his younger brother used to own a small construction business together years ago. Then they got into some huge argument over money. Neither one of them would apologize. Months turned into years. Years turned into more than a decade. Then apparently Frank found out through another relative that his brother had been diagnosed with cancer. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough that it made him realize he didn't actually care about the argument anymore. He just wanted to talk to him. So he'd called another family member asking for his brother's number. They gave him one. Mine. At one point he actually laughed and said, "I guess somebody in the family still doesn't want us talking." I laughed too, mostly because I had no idea what else to do. Eventually he apologized for taking up my time. I told him it honestly wasn't a problem. Before hanging up, he goes, "You've probably been nicer to me in 45 minutes than most people have all week." I didn't really know how to respond to that, so I just wished him luck. That should have been the end of it. Random phone call. Weird story. Move on. Except the next afternoon I got another call. Same number. I answered. Before I could even say hello, he goes, "I found him." I actually sat up. "What?" "My brother." Apparently after we got off the phone, he'd spent hours searching online. Old Facebook accounts, property records, even old newspaper articles. Eventually he found someone who knew someone who still had his brother's real number. He called him. His brother answered. Frank said the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Neither of them cried. Neither of them apologized. They mostly just sat there in awkward silence. But before hanging up, his brother said, "Call me tomorrow." Frank told me that was the first real conversation they'd had in over 12 years. He thanked me again. I remember laughing and saying, "I didn't really do anything." He goes, "No, if you hadn't answered, I probably would have just gone home thinking my brother didn't want to hear from me." That sentence stuck with me, because he wasn't entirely wrong. If I'd ignored the call like I almost always do, he would have assumed the fake number was intentional. He probably never would have kept looking. We talked for maybe another 10 minutes before hanging up. This time I actually thought that was the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because about a month later, Frank called again. And this time, he asked me if I'd be willing to do him a favor that honestly made me question whether answering that first phone call had been a good idea at all. A couple seconds go by before I ask, "What kind of favor?" He goes, "Would you be willing to meet my brother?" I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. I was like, "What?" He laughs. I know how weird that sounds. Then he explains. Apparently he'd been talking to his brother almost every day since they reconnected. Things were going well, but there was still, I don't know, this weird tension between them. Frank had told his brother about the wrong number, about how he'd accidentally called some random guy who stayed on the phone with him for almost an hour. And for whatever reason, his brother apparently found the whole thing hilarious. He kept saying, "I want to meet the guy who answered." I honestly thought Frank was joking. I said, "You're telling me your brother wants to meet some random dude because I answered the phone?" Frank goes, "Pretty much." Now here's the part that made it even weirder. His brother only lived like an hour away from me. Frank was the one living 3 states over. So his idea was that if he ever came to visit his brother, the 3 of us could grab lunch. just once. I didn't really know what to say. On one hand, that's an incredibly strange request. On the other hand, it wasn't dangerous or anything. It was just weird. I told him I'd think about it. He laughed and said, "That's probably the correct answer." A couple weeks went by. Honestly, I'd pretty much forgotten about it. Then Frank calls again. This time he goes, "I'm flying in next Saturday." So apparently he thought I'd agreed. I was like, "Wait, I never actually said yes." He goes, "I know." Another pause. "But you didn't say no either." I had to laugh. That was actually a pretty solid argument. So somehow, the following Saturday, I found myself sitting in this little diner with two brothers I'd never met before. It was honestly one of the weirdest situations I've ever been in. Frank recognized me immediately, got up, shook my hand, thanked me again. Then he introduced me to his brother David. The very first thing David says is, "So you're the guy with my phone number." I go, "Apparently." He starts laughing. Then he reaches into his wallet, pulls out this tiny folded piece of paper, slides it across the table. I unfold it. It's my phone number, written in pen, except one digit was wrong. Just one, the last number had been written as a 3 instead of an 8. That was it. One tiny mistake. I just stared at it, because that's honestly kind of terrifying. Think about how many times you've probably written your own phone number. Imagine getting one digit wrong. That's all it took. If whoever wrote it had been paying just a little more attention, Frank never would have called me. We all kind of sat there looking at that piece of paper. Then David goes, "You know what's funny? If he'd reached Michael," I was like, "Who's Michael?" He tells me Michael was actually one of their cousins. Apparently, he'd been trying to reconnect the brothers for years. He was the one who'd written the number down. He'd accidentally copied one digit wrong. Nobody noticed. Frank spent 12 years believing his brother didn't want to talk to him. His brother spent 12 years believing Frank never reached out. All because of one number. Honestly, nobody at the table really knew what to say after that. You could tell all three of us were thinking the same thing. How many years can disappear because of something that small? Lunch actually ended up being really nice. We talked about work, sports, random stories, nothing dramatic. Just normal conversation. As we were leaving, Frank shook my hand again and goes, "I know this sounds dramatic, but answering that phone probably changed my life." I didn't really know how to respond, because honestly, he might have been right. A wrong number had somehow turned into two brothers talking again after more than a decade. I got in my car afterward thinking, well, that's probably the strangest thing that'll ever happen because of my phone. I really believed that. Until about 6 months later, when I got another call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Then I remembered Frank. So I answered. And the first words I heard were, "Hi, I think I was given your number by mistake." That's when I realized this whole thing might not have been as random as I thought. I answer the phone. "Hello?" There's a second of silence. Then this woman goes, "Hi, I'm really sorry if this is weird." I kind of laughed. I've heard that one before. She sounded confused. "What do you mean?" So I gave her the really short version of the Frank story. She laughed and said, "Well, mine isn't nearly as interesting." Apparently she'd ordered a couch off Facebook Marketplace. The seller accidentally typed one digit wrong in his phone number. Mine. She'd been texting me all morning wondering why I wasn't answering. We both laughed about it. I gave her the correct number after she double-checked the listing. We said goodbye. Pretty normal. Except, like 20 minutes later, I got another text. Not from her. From the actual seller. It said, "Sorry about that. She told me she accidentally texted you instead." Then another message came in. "Out of curiosity, how'd you know she'd been trying to buy a couch?" I stared at my phone. "Because I hadn't told him. I just replied," she told me. A minute later, he answers, "Oh, then, I thought maybe she'd left that part out." I didn't really think much of it, until another text came through. Honestly, probably for the best. Now I was curious, so I asked, "What do you mean?" He was typing for what felt like forever. Finally, he sends, "That couch belonged to my wife. She passed away last year." He told me he'd been trying to clean out the house. The couch was the last big thing left. Apparently, he'd listed it 3 separate times, but kept backing out whenever someone wanted to buy it. This was the first time he'd actually committed. I didn't really know what to say, so I just said, "I'm sorry." He thanked me. Then he goes, "Funny enough, I almost didn't list it this week." I asked why. He said because that would have been their anniversary. He'd been putting it off for months. Something about hearing a complete stranger accidentally answer his phone, then hearing that stranger actually take the time to help instead of getting annoyed, made him feel like maybe it was finally time to let it go. Now, I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but that's literally what he said. We texted for another 10 minutes. Nothing crazy, just life. He eventually thanked me for helping, even though technically I'd done almost nothing. That should have been another one-off interaction. Except, about a month later, I got a Christmas card, addressed to me. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. It said, "Thanks for reminding me there are still good people willing to answer the phone. No name, just that." It took me a minute before I realized who it had to be. The couch guy. I don't know why, but I actually kept that card. It's still sitting in a drawer somewhere. Mostly because it reminded me how weird life can be. Think about it. If one digit hadn't been wrong, Frank never calls me. If Frank never calls me, maybe I ignore that second unknown number. If I ignore that one, maybe that guy never gets that little push he needed to finally move on. It's kind of weird how many things can happen just because somebody copied down a phone number wrong. Now, you'd think after all of this I'd answer every unknown number that called me. I actually did. For almost a year. Most of them were spam, car warranty, credit cards, some robot trying to sell me solar panels. Honestly, it was mostly a waste of time. Then one afternoon, I got another unknown call. I almost laughed when I answered. I was expecting another wrong number. Instead, the first thing I heard was, "Hi, is this the guy Frank accidentally called?" I just sat there. "How on earth did you get this number?" The person laughed. "You don't know me, but Frank talks about you all the time." That's when I realized somehow I'd accidentally become part of somebody else's family story. I was honestly kind of speechless. I asked, "He talks about me?" The guy laughed. "Oh yeah. He says if you hadn't answered that phone call, he probably never would have spoken to his brother again." Turns out this guy was Frank's nephew. He had heard the whole story at a family barbecue. Apparently everybody had. I just started laughing. Because imagine explaining that. So how'd Uncle Frank reconnect with his brother? Well, he accidentally called some random guy. It sounds completely made up. The nephew goes, "I know this sounds weird, but you've kind of become family lore." Family lore. I don't know why, but that phrase absolutely killed me. He wasn't joking either. He told me every time someone new heard the story, they'd eventually ask, "So, did the random guy ever find out?" And somebody would answer, "Oh yeah, Frank still calls him every once in a while," which was true. By that point, Frank and I would talk every couple of months. Nothing serious, just random life updates. Sometimes the conversations were 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. It was funny because if you'd asked me 6 months earlier whether I'd regularly talk to a 60-something guy I'd met through a wrong number, I'd probably say no. But somehow, it just happened. A few weeks after talking to his nephew, Frank called again. He sounded happier than I'd ever heard him. He tells me, "My brother's coming over for Thanksgiving." Now, that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but then he reminds me they hadn't spent a holiday together in over 13 years. Not Christmas, not birthdays, nothing. He goes, "We're actually arguing again." I kind of froze. Seriously? Then he starts laughing. "No, this time we're arguing over who's cooking." That was probably the first time I'd ever heard him make a joke. It honestly made me smile. After that, life kind of moved on. Months went by, then almost a year. Frank and I talked less often, which honestly felt like a good thing. Not because I didn't like talking to him, but because it meant things were going well. He didn't really need someone to vent to anymore. He had his brother back. Every now and then I'd randomly wonder how they were doing. Then one afternoon I got another call from him. He goes, "I've got something for you." I was like, "What?" He says, "You'll see." About a week later, a package showed up at my apartment. No return address. Inside was this old wooden picture frame. Nothing expensive, actually kind of worn out. But inside it was a photo. It was Frank and his brother, standing outside the diner where we'd all met. I'd never actually seen the picture before. Apparently someone walking by had offered to take it for us. On the back, written in black marker, it just said, "Sometimes one wrong number leads to the right conversation." I don't know why, but that actually hit me. I put the frame on a bookshelf. It's still there. Every once in a while somebody notices it and asks, "Who's that?" And I always have to decide, do I tell the 30-second version or the 20-minute version? Because nobody ever believes the short version. Honestly, I don't know if every little detail in life happens for a reason. I don't think every coincidence has some deep meaning. Sometimes a wrong number is just a wrong number. Sometimes it's just a scam call. Sometimes it's somebody trying to sell you car insurance. But every once in a while, you answer a phone call you almost ignored. You spend 45 minutes talking to a stranger, and years later, they're still sending you Christmas cards. They're still telling your story at family gatherings. And you somehow become part of a family you never would have met otherwise. All because somebody wrote down an 8 instead of a 3. Now whenever my phone rings from a number I don't recognize, I still hesitate. Most of the time it's spam. Sometimes it's a doctor's office. Sometimes it's a delivery driver. But every single time, for just a second, I wonder, what if this one's another Frank? About 3 years have passed now. Frank still calls me once in a while, not nearly as often as he used to. Sometimes it's on my birthday, sometimes around Christmas, sometimes just because he saw something that reminded him of one of our conversations. And honestly, it doesn't even feel weird anymore. It just feels like talking to an old friend, which is kind of insane when you think about how we met. The funniest part is, I don't even know what would have happened if I'd ignored that first call. Maybe Frank would have eventually found his brother anyway. Maybe he wouldn't have. There's really no way to know. But I do know one thing. That phone call changed my perspective more than anything. Before all of that happened, if an unknown number called me, I'd immediately assume it was spam or someone trying to sell me something. Now I still assume that. I'm not completely crazy. But every now and then, I'll answer. Just in case. A few months ago, I was telling this story to one of my coworkers during lunch. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finally finished, he just looked at me and said, "So, you're basically saying I should start answering random phone calls?" I laughed. "No, I'm saying every once in a while life gets really weird." He nodded like he understood. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. We both looked at it. He looked at me, I looked at him. He goes, "If this is another Frank, I'm blaming you." He answered. "Hello?" I was honestly invested at that point. He listened for about 5 seconds. Then he goes, "No, sorry, I think you've got the wrong number." He hangs up, looks at me, pizza place. Apparently somebody had accidentally typed his number instead of the local pizza restaurant. We both started laughing. I told him, "See, that's usually how these stories end." For the next couple of weeks, we'd joke about it. Every time his phone rang at work, I'd ask Frank. He'd just shake his head. Then one afternoon, he walks into my office with the weirdest look on his face. I immediately knew something had happened. He goes, "Remember that pizza place?" I said, "Yeah." He sits down and goes, "The guy called me back." Apparently the man who'd accidentally called him apologized again. They started talking. Turned out he'd just moved to town. Didn't know anybody. One conversation led to another. A month later, my coworker helped him move into his apartment. A few months after that, they were grabbing lunch every other week. I couldn't believe it. I literally started laughing. I was like, no way. He just points at me and goes, "This is your fault." Now I know that's probably just another coincidence. Maybe people have these random interactions all the time and nobody talks about them. But it did make me realize something. Most strangers stay strangers, not because they're meant to, just because nobody says anything. One random conversation, one wrong number, one missed train, one delayed flight, one person deciding to ask, "Hey, can I ask you something?" That's really all it takes sometimes. I don't think every random encounter is supposed to change your life. Most won't. Most of them won't even be memorable. But every once in a while, you answer a call you almost ignored. You stay on the line 5 minutes longer than you planned. And years later, you've got a picture frame on your bookshelf, a Christmas card in your drawer, a guy in another state who still checks in on you, and a story that sounds completely made up every time you tell it. All because one person wrote down the wrong phone number. Honestly, I still don't know who Michael is. But wherever he is, he accidentally introduced me to one of the nicest people I've ever met, without ever realizing it. A while after all of that, I actually got curious. I wondered if Michael, the guy Frank had originally been trying to call, ever found out what happened. So one day when Frank called, I asked him, "Did Michael ever hear the story?" Frank laughed. Oh yeah, he still gets blamed for it. Apparently every family gathering, somebody eventually brings it up. Someone will go, "Hey Michael, make sure you double check the phone number this time." And everyone laughs. I asked if Michael felt bad. Frank goes, he did at first, but honestly, he's kind of proud of it now. Which is such a weird sentence. Imagine accidentally reconnecting two brothers because your handwriting was terrible. I don't think that's on many Ursums. A few months later, Frank sent me another picture. This one was from a family reunion. There had to be 20 or 30 people in it. Kids running around, people standing by the grill, everybody smiling. He'd circled himself and his brother with a red marker. Then underneath he'd written, "Wouldn't have happened." That's it. Just those 3 words. I sat there looking at that picture for a while, because it's honestly kind of impossible to know how much one tiny decision matters. If I'd ignored the phone, maybe none of that picture happens. Maybe it still does. Who knows? Life doesn't really let you compare timelines. You only get the one. About a year after that, Frank called me with some bad news. His brother had gotten sick again. This time it was a lot more serious. You could hear it in Frank's voice. He wasn't looking for advice. He wasn't really looking for anything. I think he just wanted someone to talk to. We were on the phone for almost 2 hours. A lot of the conversation wasn't even about being sick. We talked about baseball, about old jobs, about terrible coffee, about how every family has at least one person who's impossible to argue with because they somehow think they're always right. Near the end of the call, he got quiet. Then he said, I got 13 more years with my brother than I thought I was going to. That sentence has stuck with me ever since. Not because it was dramatic, just because it was true. He wasn't talking about wishing they'd had more time. He was grateful they'd gotten any time back at all. His brother passed away a few months later. Frank called me after the funeral. He sounded sad but peaceful. He told me they never really talked about the old argument again. After they reconnected, it just stopped mattering. He said, "It's strange. I spent over a decade thinking that argument was the biggest thing in my life. And then one day it wasn't. We talked for a while. Before hanging up, he thanked me again. I kind of laughed. 'Frank, you really have to stop thanking me.' I answered the phone. That's literally all I did." He was quiet for a second. Then he said something I'll probably remember forever. "No, you listened. There's a difference." After we hung up, I thought about that for a long time. Because he's right. Answering the phone only took a second. Staying on the line, that was the part that mattered. I still have the picture frame. I still have the Christmas card. And every now and then, when life feels busy and everybody seems to be rushing somewhere, I think about an old guy who accidentally dialed one wrong number and somehow found exactly the person he needed to talk to. Not because I was special, not because I had some amazing advice, just because on one random afternoon, I had time. And sometimes that's enough. A couple of years have gone by since then. Frank still calls every now and then, not because he needs anything. Usually it's just to tell me about something dumb that happened. One time he called me because he'd accidentally locked himself out of his house. I was like, "Why are you calling me?" He goes, "I already called the locksmith. I've got 20 minutes to kill." That's just kind of the friendship we ended up with. Sometimes we'd go 3 months without talking. Then we'd spend an hour catching up like no time had passed. One day I finally asked him something I'd been wondering for years. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd never called me?" He didn't even hesitate. No, I thought that was kind of a surprising answer. I asked why. He goes, "Because I did. I can't change the version where I didn't. I only get this one." Honestly, that stuck with me more than almost anything else he'd ever said. It's easy to spend your life wondering about all the different paths things could have taken. What if I'd taken a different job? What if I'd moved to another city? What if I'd ignored that call? But none of those versions actually exist. The only one that matters is the one you're living. About 6 months later, I got another package in the mail. Inside was a notebook. Not a new one, an old one. Frank had written a note inside the front cover. "Thought you'd appreciate this." Apparently, it had belonged to his brother. It was just a notebook full of random stuff. Grocery lists, phone numbers, things to fix around the house, reminders to call people, nothing important, except for one page. About halfway through the notebook, there was a list titled "People I Need to Call." There were maybe 15 names. Some had check marks next to them, some didn't. Frank's name was on the list. No check mark. I just stared at it. Because his brother had apparently planned on calling him too. He just never got around to it. That's probably the part of the whole story that hit me the hardest. For over a decade, both brothers thought the other one didn't care enough to reach out. Meanwhile, they'd both been thinking about it. Neither one knew the other felt exactly the same way. It wasn't pride anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was just time. Time has a weird way of making simple things feel impossible. You don't call today. Then tomorrow feels awkward. Next week feels even more awkward. Then suddenly it's been 5 years, and now you have no idea how to start the conversation. I think that happens to a lot more people than we'd like to admit. Friends, family, even old coworkers. You always assume there'll be another chance. Sometimes there is. Sometimes there isn't. I actually called my older cousin after reading that notebook. We hadn't talked in almost 4 years. There wasn't a reason. Life just kind of happened. The conversation started with, "Hey, this is random." And you know what he said? "I was literally thinking about calling you last week." I just laughed. Apparently everyone thinks someone else should make the first move. A few days after that, I called Frank. I thanked him for sending the notebook back. He goes, "I almost didn't." I asked why. He said, "I figured it was just a bunch of old paper." Then he laughed. I guess we've learned not to underestimate little things. I think that's probably the biggest lesson I've taken from all of this. Most people think life changes because of huge moments. Winning the lottery, getting married, moving across the country. Those things matter. But honestly, sometimes your entire life shifts because you answered a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon when you almost let it ring. Sometimes because you stayed on the line an extra 10 minutes. Sometimes because somebody accidentally wrote an 8 instead of a 3. It's kind of comforting in a weird way. Because it means the small things matter too. You just usually don't realize it until years later. It's been almost 10 years now. Frank's in his 70s. I'm older too. Life's happened. Jobs changed. People moved away. The world looks completely different than it did when that phone rang that afternoon. But every once in a while, my phone lights up. Frank calling. And I still smile before I answer. The conversations are different now. We don't really tell the big stories anymore. It's mostly little stuff. He'll call to complain about the weather, or because he tried fixing something around the house and somehow made it worse. One time he called me because he'd spent 45 minutes looking for his glasses. They were on his head. I laughed so hard I could barely breathe. He goes, "Don't laugh. I know you're gonna do this someday too." He's probably right. A few months ago he called me for another reason. He said, "I've got one more thing to tell you." Immediately my brain went to the worst possible place. I asked, "Everything okay?" He goes, "Yeah," then he laughed. "I just wanted to tell you Michael finally admitted it." I was confused. Admitted what? The phone number. Apparently, for almost 20 years, everyone thought Michael had accidentally copied one digit wrong. Turns out, he never actually wrote the number down. He'd memorized it, or at least he thought he had. When Frank asked for the number all those years ago, Michael had just said it out loud. One digit was wrong because he remembered it wrong. He wasn't reading anything. He just confidently gave Frank the wrong number. Frank started laughing. David started laughing. Eventually, Michael admitted, "Yeah, that's probably on me." Apparently, that became the new family joke. Whenever somebody forgot something, someone else would say, "Better ask Michael." I don't know why, but that somehow made the whole story even funnier. There was never a piece of paper. No bad handwriting. No smudged ink. Just one guy being incredibly confident and incredibly wrong. Frank goes, "I figured you'd appreciate the update." I honestly did. Because somehow, after all these years, the story still wasn't finished. Before we hung up, Frank asked me something. He goes, "Do people still believe you when you tell this story?" I laughed. "No, nobody does." He goes, "Good. I don't think I'd believe it either." Honestly, I probably wouldn't. If somebody told me they answered one random phone call, became friends with a stranger, met his family, stayed in touch for nearly a decade, and ended up hearing about new chapters of the story years later, I'd probably think they were exaggerating. But life doesn't really care whether a story sounds believable. Sometimes weird things just happen. Last month I was cleaning out a drawer. I found the Christmas card, the old photo, even the envelope Frank had mailed years ago. I sat there for a minute just looking at all of it. It's strange how a couple pieces of paper can remind you of an entire decade. I almost threw the envelope away. Then I noticed something. I'd never looked that closely at the return address. It wasn't Frank's house. It was a retirement community. I didn't think much of it until I called him later that week. I asked, "So when were you going to tell me?" He laughed. "I was wondering when you'd notice." Apparently he'd moved there almost a year earlier. He loved it. Said there were card games every Wednesday, terrible coffee every morning, and one guy who somehow always won at bingo. Then he goes, "You know what's funny? I met my best friend there because he dialed the wrong apartment number." I actually started laughing. No way, I swear. Apparently one evening his phone rang. An older man apologized because he'd meant to call apartment 214. Frank lived in 124. They got talking. Then they started having coffee together. Now they eat lunch together almost every day. I just sat there smiling. I was like, "You've got to be kidding me." He goes, "I guess wrong numbers just follow me around." Maybe they do. Or maybe Frank's just the kind of person who never lets a stranger stay a stranger for very long. And honestly, I think that's the real reason this whole story happened. It wasn't because of luck. It wasn't fate. It wasn't one wrong digit. It was because when life accidentally introduced Frank to someone new, he didn't hang up. He stayed. And looking back, I'm really glad I stayed too. I don't know if this story has a lesson. People always ask me that. Whenever I tell someone the whole thing, they eventually go, "So, what's the takeaway?" Honestly, I don't think there needs to be one. Sometimes life doesn't wrap itself up with some perfect message. Sometimes weird things just happen, but if I had to pick one thing, it's probably this. You never really know which ordinary day is going to become a story you tell for the next 10 years. The day Frank called me, there was nothing special about it. I woke up late. I made coffee. I watched TV for a while. It was just another Tuesday. If you'd asked me that morning what I was going to remember about that day a decade later, I probably would have said, nothing. And then my phone rang. That's it. That's where the whole thing started. One ringtone, one decision, one conversation that should have lasted maybe 30 seconds. Instead, it somehow became part of both of our lives. Every now and then I'll catch myself looking at an unknown number on my phone. My thumb hovers over the screen. Part of me still thinks it's probably spam. And honestly, most of the time it is. Sometimes it's somebody trying to sell me insurance. Sometimes it's a robot asking about my car's extended warranty. Sometimes it's just someone who typed one number wrong. I don't answer all of them, but every once in a while I do. Not because I'm expecting another incredible story. Honestly, I doubt there will ever be another Frank. Some things only happen once. But I guess I like knowing there's a chance. A tiny one. That somewhere out there, somebody's having the worst day of their week, or the best day of their life, and somehow, completely by accident, our paths might cross for 5 minutes. You never really know. Frank still calls every now and then. Our conversations are shorter these days. Sometimes they're only a few minutes. Sometimes we don't even talk about anything important. But before we hang up, he always says the exact same thing. Thanks for answering. And every single time I tell him the truth. I'm really glad I did. Because looking back, it was never really about a wrong number. It was about two people who had absolutely no reason to know each other, choosing not to hang up. And somehow that was enough to change both of our lives. It's funny. Out of all the phone calls I've ever gotten, the one that was never meant for me ended up being the one I'll probably remember for the rest of my life.